Hello, welcome to Think for Yourself. My name is Mark Thorsby. In this video, we're taking a look at an introduction to critical thinking. We're using a workbook for arguments by David Morrow and Anthony Weston, if you'd like to follow along. So welcome back to the class. So as you know, this class is divided into a series of rules for argumentation. And I should say really rules for learning how to think more critically. In the first rule, we looked at identifying premises and conclusions. The second rule, we talked about the idea that when you create arguments and you link ideas together, they need to be organized in a way that follows a natural organization or an inferential pattern. In the third rule here, we took a look at the idea that you have to start from reliable premises. And basically the idea there was that your conclusion is only as good as the evidence you give for the conclusion. So your premises matter a whole lot. Now this fourth rule is going to be a little bit more quick, a little bit easier to understand, and it's pretty straightforward. The rule 4 is be concrete and concise. Now first off, let me say something. To talk about something being concrete means to say that it means to talk about something in a way that typically relates to something that everyone has keen awareness and access of. A real concrete example, for instance. So for instance, a lot of times you've probably had professors who explained a concept and then they gave you a sort of example or a story that embodies that idea. That's what we mean by be concrete, right? You want to be clear above all to your listeners and to your readers. You have to also be concise. That means you want to make sure you don't, when you're trying to explain something, when you're writing, you don't just write on and on and on. You want to be straight to the point and clear. Remember, the goal here, if the goal is to convince people of your claims, to convince them of your arguments, and to get them to listen to you, you need to make sure that it's easy to understand what you're talking about. And in some ways, I often remind my students when they write papers in philosophy, and you too will be writing a paper for our course, is that when you write a paper, you forget about all the fancy words that you've been accustomed to using. Forget about the technical terms, right? Try to write something that's clear, concise, and if possible, concrete. This can sometimes be a challenge in philosophy, but you should aim for it regardless. Now, what does that mean in the negative sense? Well, it means, A, we need to avoid abstract, vague, and general terms, okay? So an abstract term is a term that's ultimately unclear. Now, remember, what does it mean to abstract something from something else? So for instance, here I have a mug, right? And when I look at the mug and I think about the mug, I can abstract different properties of the mug into other things, right? Like for instance, I could say this has a certain sort of corporeality. It has extension in space. And so I could say that it's a corporeal cup, right? Now that I've abstracted there, and ultimately that sort of abstraction just usually, unless it's for a particular reason and it's related to a specific theoretical argument, usually having too many abstract terms just muddies the water for your readers and your listeners, because when people are trying to understand you, they can't keep up, frankly, because they're not sure what the abstract term relates or refers to. Now, I teach philosophy, and in philosophy, we love using lots and lots of abstract terms, primarily because we're not talking about concrete things, we're talking about abstract things. So we have to use abstract terms to some degree, but we have to be careful because we have to always recognize that the uses of abstract terms has a negative potential effect. It can actually make things less clear. So if there's a way to say something without an abstract term and just to say it directly, you should, at least for a regular audience. Now, if you're giving a presentation in a philosophy class, you want to use the correct abstract terms that are related to the topic you're talking about. So if you're talking about Descartes, you want to use the term rationalism, for instance, but it's not a term you would normally use in an everyday conversation. So keep things honed in to your audience. One thing is to also think about vague language and vagueness. You want to avoid being vague, and you want to avoid using language that's vague. Now, keep in mind here, we can have ideas, and our ideas can be vague, but sometimes the very words we use to compose our ideas are also vague. How can we define vagueness? Well, Vagueness, on the one hand, is something that has an unclear extension. And I'm going to explain that in just a moment. It also seems to include, another example of vagueness, is anything that can be an example of a Sorites paradox. I'm going to explain that here in just a minute. Okay? But the third here is that when you use general terms, you use highly generalized terms, then the problem is then you lack specificity. So there's this sort of kind of balance. You don't want to use terms and language that's too specific, too technical and abstract that it gets in the way. But on the other hand, you don't want to use such a generalized term that there's no specificity, and then it's not concrete any longer, right? So when we talk about let's go back to vagueness here. Vagueness is very interesting. In fact, philosophically, go ahead and take a look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on vagueness, and you'll see that philosophers have a lot to say about vagueness and a lot of problems with vagueness. Now, what is a vague term? Well, to understand vagueness, you have to understand how a word functions. There's two functions that every term has. It has a connotation, it connotes, and it has a denotation, it denotes, right? So you have connotation, you have denotation. Now let's start off with the connotation. The connotation refers to a word, when you have a term, it refers to the attributes, the essence, essentially the dictionary definition of the term, right? This is also known as the intention of the term, right? So for instance, if I have the word cup, right, I could say that a cup is anything that can hold liquid out of which one can drink, right? It's sort of my definition on the fly of what a cup is. And you can see that I've given you a list of attributes such that if you take another object and that object, you're able to check off all those attributes for that object, then this object would therefore also be a cup, right? And philosophers, at least in Platonic philosophy, for instance, sometimes call this the essence of a word, right? It's at the core of it. This is the intention of a term. Right. So knowing the intention of a term essentially means knowing what the term is about. Now, denotation, and I put it sort of underneath because I like to think that the denotation is when the word hits the ground, as it were. Because a denotation refers to the class members. Who counts as a member of the term, right? So the attribute tells you what a cup is. A denotation tells you which kinds of things count as cups, right, or as class members, right? So you can have intention and denotation. So for instance, if I say the Queen of England, right, well, the connotation of the Queen of England, that term, right? Remember, a term doesn't have to be one word. It could be a phrase, right? A term refers to some sort of category. So if I say the Queen of England, well, the Queen of England refers to a specific type of person, right? A person who's born and has been crowned, has a royal birth and who's been crowned Queen of England, etc., right? That's the attribute, but the denotation of the term is Queen Elizabeth. There's only one Queen of England, at least right now, and there's only one living Queen of England, and that's Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth. But there are other class members of queens include Queen Victoria, for instance, and so on and so forth. Now, it's interesting, though, philosophers have noted that it's possible to have an intention without an extension, or a connotation without a denotation. For instance, the current King of France. The current King of France, when I give you that term, you know what I'm talking about, the essence and the attributes. You're talking about someone who's of royal birth, who's been crowned the King of France, etc. But the denotation, who counts as the current King of France? No one, because France is no longer a monarchy. So France no longer even has any kings, so there is no extension or denotation for that term. Okay, so we have on the one hand this language of connotation, on the other hand, this language of denotation. It can get confusing. Let's go back over here to vagueness. We said vagueness is when you have an unclear extension or denotation, right? So for instance, if I say, imagine if I say, can you pick up that book for me? And I'm pointing at all these different books. You say, which book? The one over there, right? And, in that case, you know that I want a book, so you're clear on the connotation of my words, but you're not clear on the extension or the denotation. You don't know what I'm applying my concepts to. So vagueness is when you have where it's difficult to tell what counts as what, right? An example, another way of seeing this is recognizing that vagueness includes the Sorites paradox. Now, what is the Sorites paradox? Sorites comes from the Greek term which means a heap or a pile, right? So in the famous Sorites paradox, it involves sand, right? All of us know what a pile of sand looks like. You've probably been to the beach or been to a volleyball court, and you've seen piles of sand, right? So we all know what a pile is, but the question is, when does a pile become a pile? Because when you just have one piece of sand, one grain of sand, tiny little thing with the microscope, you guys see it. If you have one grain of sand, that's not a pile of sand. And if you just have 2 grains of sand, is that a pile? Well, not in the ordinary normal sense. 3 grains of sand? No. 4? Not really. But at some point, 3 and 4 grains of sand eventually multiplies into a pile of sand. You can see here, the problem with the Sorites paradox is, well, at what point does it go from not being a pile of sand to becoming a pile of sand? It's the same problem of extension. At what point do our terms apply here and not here? Or not here and then there, right? So when things are unclear, when the language itself is unclear, this is a sort of vagueness. So if you feel there's a Sorites paradox, or you're unclear how to use the term, then at that point you should know that maybe there's a problem, right? So you want to watch out for using terms that are too abstract, terms that are too abstract, vague, or use general terms. So all in all, this means we need to be concise with our language. Less is more when you're making an argument or you're writing a paper. It's better to be concise instead of going on and on and on about something. Because as you go on and on and on, it becomes less clear for your reader what you're actually trying to do. Now, the exercise for this rule of thinking is what we're going to do is we're going to be decomplexifying artificially obtruse quotations. So what we have here is we have arguments that are given to us in these small quotations, and I believe all of them come from real sources, so we're not making this stuff up, but it's extremely difficult to understand. And so one of the tasks for practicing our critical thinking skills is take a passage and then rewrite the passage in language that's clear and simpler. So here's an example of an argument that's terribly difficult to understand, even though it has a simple point, and it says this. And this is a quote, I forgot who, from the Washington Post. Oh, no, I'm not sure who it is. This passage came from, I'm not sure where it came from. Anyway, we won't worry about it. But it's terrible. It says, of this relatively limited extension of one of the ambulatory limbs of this particular male of the species Homo sapiens, it might also be possible to declare that a relatively much larger extension of the reach of the human species as a whole, so to speak, is also concurrently taking place at this point in time. Now, that sounds like it's smart, and maybe it is smart, but it's not clear, and it's difficult to understand what someone's talking about. And most people, if they started reading this, would probably justifiably stop reading. And that's what you don't want to happen. And maybe even more importantly, when you start reading this, you stop thinking. Remember, the goal of this course is to think for yourself. So if we were going to rearrange this passage, we would want to basically say it in as simple a terms as possible, right? Basically what this person's saying is that of this relatively limited extension of one of the ambulatory limbs of this particular male of the species Homo sapiens, so they're talking about the length of someone's arm, it might also be possible to declare a relatively much larger extension of the reach of the human species as a whole, right? So the idea here is this person seems to have a pretty limited extension of one of their limbs, but this is not an example of the human species as a whole, which at the very same time as this person also has larger extension. That's how I understand it. And so what I would recommend is read these, talk them out loud, and then rewrite them in simpler language. This is a very good exercise because one of the things you have to do as a critical thinker is you have to take that which is complex and make it comprehensible. Okay? And that means not only do we start from reliable premises, but it also means that we have to be concrete and give concise arguments. Okay? Thank you very much for watching our video series. Take a look at our next video coming up next week, which is going to move us forward into the question of we should always build on substance, not just just the tone or the overtone of something. Okay? Thank you very much for watching. I look forward to seeing you guys online. Talk to you later.